Private Jake Lawson trudged through the vast desert, his boots sinking slightly in the soft sand with every step. The sun blazed high above, casting the world in a harsh golden light. He wiped the sweat from his brow and scanned the horizon. The endless dunes of Zoreth stretched out before him, and the only sounds were the occasional gusts of wind and the soft hum of his equipment. The desert planet was known for its extreme conditions. The temperature during the day could soar to over 100 degrees, and the nights were freezing cold. Jake had been stationed here for months, part of a peacekeeping mission with his unit. They were supposed to assist with setting up base camps, help with diplomatic efforts, and ensure the safety of the alien species that called Zoreth home. But he never imagined he'd be out here alone, miles from base, battling the unforgiving heat of the desert. His team had been out on a routine patrol when a sudden sandstorm had hit, scattering them in different directions. Jake had been separated from the group, and despite his best efforts to locate them, the storm had left him disoriented and lost. The radio had stopped working, and his water supply had nearly run out. The isolation of the desert was taking a toll on him, but he pressed on, his military training keeping him focused. As he crested a small dune, Jake's eyes caught something strange in the distance, a small figure lying motionless on the sand. His heart raced, and he pushed forward, every instinct telling him it was someone in need of help. The figure was barely visible against the harsh backdrop of the desert, but it was unmistakable, a person, or at least what appeared to be a person. He hurried toward the figure, each step bringing him closer to the mysterious sight. As he got nearer, he could see that it was a woman, her body sprawled out in the sand, barely moving. She had long, shimmering skin that glowed faintly in the sunlight, a strange feature that immediately marked her as something other than human. Her clothes were tattered, and her once beautiful features were marked by exhaustion, dehydration, and the harsh conditions of the desert. Jake knelt beside her, feeling for a pulse. It was faint, but she was alive. Her breathing was shallow, and she was burning with fever. He quickly pulled off his jacket and draped it over her, then set to work with his emergency medical kit. There was no time to waste. If he didn't get her to shelter soon, she wouldn't make it. "Hey," Jake said softly, leaning close to her. "Stay with me. I'm gonna get you out of here." He couldn't understand how she had ended up alone in the desert, but that wasn't important now. He needed to get her to safety, and quickly. As he lifted her into his arms, the woman stirred slightly, her eyes flickering open. She looked at him, confusion and fear in her eyes, and then weakly whispered, "You found me." Jake nodded, his voice steady. "Yeah, I've got you. Just hold on." He started back toward the direction of the base, his mind racing. The desert was harsh, but he had made a promise. He would keep her safe. Jake Lawson moved quickly, carefully holding the woman in his arms as he trudged back toward the base. The desert heat beat down on him relentlessly, but he pushed forward. The faint glow from her skin was the only sign that she was still alive. She was so light, yet so fragile, and Jake felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him. Her breathing was shallow, and her body burned with fever. Despite the jacket he had wrapped around her, she felt cold to the touch. Jake had seen many injuries, but nothing like this, nothing that made him feel so helpless. He had to get her back to the base medical facilities, but the distance seemed endless. The storm had scattered his team, and now it was just him and this stranger, this woman, who he could barely understand. As he moved forward, he looked down at her, her delicate features marked by exhaustion. Her hair, long and almost silver, had sand tangled in it. Her clothes were torn, and she looked like she had been wandering the desert for days. How had she ended up here? Where were her people? "Hold on," Jake muttered under his breath, pushing through the growing exhaustion in his own body. He could feel the weight of the sun on his back, the sweat dripping down his face, but his focus never wavered. She was in no condition to survive this environment for much longer. If he didn't get her help, she might not make it. Her eyelids fluttered, And she looked up at him again, her eyes tired but filled with a sense of quiet desperation. Her voice, soft but clear, made Jake stop in his tracks. "Who are you?" she asked weakly, her words barely audible. Jake took a deep breath, trying to calm his own racing heart. "I'm Private Jake Lawson, from Earth. I'm with the peacekeeping unit stationed here. I found you in the desert." She blinked slowly, as if trying to process his words. Her gaze softened, but she still seemed distant, her mind clearly struggling to focus. "I am Lyra," she whispered. "I was lost." Jake nodded, gently shifting her weight in his arms. "Lyra," he repeated, testing the name. "Don't worry, you're safe now. We'll get you the help you need." Lyra's eyes closed again, and Jake felt her body go limp in his arms. Panic surged in his chest. He shook her gently, calling her name. "Lyra, stay with me." Her eyelids fluttered open again, and she tried to smile, but the effort seemed to drain what little strength she had left. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't think anyone would find me." Jake's chest tightened at her words. She had been abandoned, left to die in the vast desert. His mind raced with questions, but for now, all that mattered was getting her to safety. He glanced at the distant base, now visible on the horizon. The journey was far from over, but they were close. He could make it. They could make it. "I won't leave you, Lyra," Jake promised, his voice firm. "I'll get you home." Her eyes closed again, and this time, she didn't struggle to stay awake. As Jake kept walking, he could only hope that the small amount of life left in her would last until they reached the base. There was no time to waste, and Lyra needed him more than ever. The journey back to the base was long and grueling. Jake could feel the weight of Lyra in his arms, but he didn't dare stop. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and the temperature was dropping, but the heat of the desert still clung to the air. Every step felt harder, but he kept moving forward, his eyes locked on the base in the distance. Lyra's body was growing colder with every minute. Her breathing was shallow, and she hadn't said a word in what felt like hours. Jake had to keep his focus, but his thoughts kept drifting to the questions he had. Who was she? How had she ended up here alone in the desert? And why did she look so different from the people he had seen on this planet before? He tried to push those thoughts aside. The most important thing now was getting her help. They were so close, but it still felt like the base was miles away. He forced himself to keep moving, step by step, trying to ignore the exhaustion threatening to slow him down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake reached the gates of the base. The soldiers at the entrance immediately took notice of him, and one of them rushed over to help. "Private Lawson," the soldier called out. "What happened? Where's your team?" Jake didn't even have the energy to explain. He motioned toward the unconscious woman in his arms. "I found her in the desert. She's badly injured. She needs medical help now." The soldier nodded quickly, signaling for other medics to come over. Within seconds, a team of medical personnel rushed to them, taking Lyra gently from Jake's arms and placing her on a stretcher. The doctors quickly began to assess her condition, hooking her up to various devices to stabilize her. Jake watched anxiously as they worked, his heart still racing. Lyra's skin had lost its faint glow, and her face was pale from exhaustion. He could only hope that they had reached her in time. One of the doctors, a woman with short brown hair, turned to him after a moment. "She's in serious condition, but she'll make it," the doctor said, her voice calm but urgent. "We'll do everything we can." Jake let out a sigh of relief, his body finally giving in to the exhaustion he had been holding back. The doctor's words were a small comfort, but he knew that the road to recovery for Lyra would be long. Still, for now, she was safe. He watched as they wheeled her into the medical bay, a feeling of relief washing over him. He had done what he had set out to do. He had saved her. But as he turned away, the reality of the situation started to hit him. He didn't know what had happened to Lyra, why she had been alone in the desert, or who had left her to die. but those answers would have to wait. For now, Jake had done his part, and as he made his way to the base's barracks to rest, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet understand. The next morning, Jake Lawson sat in the small, sterile waiting room of the medical bay. The soft hum of the machines filled the silence, but it did little to calm the anxiety that gnawed at him. Lyra had been taken into critical care, and the doctors were doing everything they could, but the longer he waited, the more restless he became. He kept replaying the events in his mind, finding her in the desert, seeing her barely alive. The memory of how fragile she had been in his arms made his stomach twist. He had never encountered an alien like her before. Her glowing skin, her delicate features, and the strength hidden beneath the exhaustion were things he would never forget. But now, with her unconscious and recovering, Jake couldn't help but feel a deep connection to her, despite knowing so little about who she was. The door to the medical bay opened, and Dr. Lena Hayes stepped out, her face tired but calm. She had been working with Lyra all night. "Private Lawson," she greeted him, her voice firm but kind. "She's stable now, but it's going to be a while before she fully recovers." Jake stood up, his eyes full of concern. "How is she? Will she be okay?" Dr. Hayes nodded. "We've treated her for dehydration, fever, and the exhaustion she suffered in the desert. She's in better shape than she was, but there's still a long road ahead. Her body is weak, but we're hopeful. We'll continue monitoring her closely." Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Lyra had survived the worst, and now it was just a matter of time. He could see the relief in the doctor's eyes, but he also understood that Lyra wasn't just a medical case. She was a person with her own history, her own story, and he had no idea what that story was. "Can I see her?" Jake asked, his voice gentle. Dr. Hayes looked at him for a moment, as if weighing the question. "She's still unconscious, but I'll allow a brief visit. Just don't overdo it. She needs rest." "Thank you," Jake said quickly, following the doctor down the hallway. They passed several rooms, all filled with the soft beeping of monitors and the quiet hum of life-saving equipment. Finally, they reached the room where Lyra was resting. The sight of her lying in the bed, connected to various machines, took Jake's breath away. Her skin had regained some of its natural glow, and she appeared peaceful now, though her face was still gaunt from the ordeal. The doctor stepped aside, allowing Jake to approach. He walked slowly to her side and stood there for a moment, watching her. He could see that she had a beauty about her, even in her weakened state. The desert had taken its toll, but there was something about her that made him want to protect her. He pulled up a chair and sat next to her bed, gently reaching out and brushing a strand of hair from her face. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "You're safe now, Lyra. I'll be here when you wake up." Jake didn't know how long he sat there. Time seemed to lose its meaning in that moment. He wasn't sure what the future held for them, but something told him that Lyra's presence in his life was about to change everything. The next few days felt like a blur to Jake Lawson. The hours spent in the medical bay, watching over Lyra, seemed to stretch on forever. She remained unconscious for most of the time, but every now and then her eyes would flutter open, and for a brief moment, she'd recognize him. Jake couldn't explain why, but each time she stirred, his heart would race, and the need to protect her grew stronger. During one of these moments, Jake was sitting by her side, reading through a report on his tablet. The low hum of the medical equipment in the background was soothing, and he found himself getting lost in the peaceful atmosphere. Then, without warning, Lyra's eyelids twitched, and she slowly opened her eyes. For a moment, her gaze was unfocused, but then she looked directly at him. "Jake," her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but hearing her speak made his heart skip a beat. "Hey," Jake replied gently, setting his tablet down and leaning closer to her. "How are you feeling?" Lyra blinked a few times, as if trying to shake off the fog of sleep. I remember you," she said slowly. Her voice was still weak, but there was a quiet strength in it that Jake admired. "You saved me." Jake smiled softly, a wave of warmth flooding his chest. "I just did what anyone would have done. I'm just glad you're awake." Her eyes searched his face, and for a moment, there was silence between them. Lyra's expression seemed to soften, and Jake could see a flicker of something, maybe gratitude or something deeper, pass across her features. "I don't know how to thank you," Lyra said, her voice filled with emotion. "You didn't have to help me, but you did." Jake shook his head, not wanting her to feel like she owed him anything. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "It's just what people do for each other." Lyra studied him for a moment, and Jake could see her mind racing. She was clearly trying to piece together everything that had happened to her. Being lost in the desert, nearly dying, and now waking up to find herself in a safe place, cared for by someone who didn't even know her. The whole situation must have felt like a dream to her. Finally, Lyra spoke again, her voice quieter now. "Where am I? What happened to the others like me?" Jake's heart sank slightly. He didn't have an answer for her. He had no idea what had happened to her people or how she had ended up alone in the desert. "You're safe now," Jake replied, doing his best to sound reassuring. "You're at the base on Zoreth. There's food, water, and medical care here. As for the others, I don't know, but we'll find out." Lyra nodded slowly, processing his words. There was a brief silence before she spoke again. "I don't remember much from before I was lost," she admitted. "But I think I owe you my life." Jake didn't want to get caught up in her gratitude. He was just glad she was alive. But something in the way she looked at him made him pause. Her eyes held a mix of vulnerability and trust, and Jake could feel the weight of that trust settling between them. "You don't owe me anything," he said gently. "But if you ever need help, I'll be here." Lyra's eyes softened, and for the first time, she smiled. Though it was faint, it was enough to show Jake that she was starting to believe that, maybe, she could have a future beyond survival. Days passed, and Lyra continued to recover under the care of the base's medical team. Though she was still weak, she was beginning to regain her strength. She ate more regularly, and her eyes started to lose the look of fear and confusion that had initially gripped them. Jake spent as much time as he could with her. He wasn't sure why, but it felt important to stay close, to ensure she knew she wasn't alone. The desert had nearly taken her life, but now, in the safety of the base, Jake wanted to make sure she could heal both physically and emotionally. Lyra's recovery was slow but steady. Each day, she grew a little stronger, and Jake found himself growing more attached to her as well. He noticed the way her eyes lit up when she asked questions about Earth, or when she marveled at the little things that were so common to him, but new to her, like the technology they used or the food they ate. She was curious, but there was a sadness in her smile, a kind of longing for something she had lost. One afternoon, Jake walked into her room after finishing his patrol. She was sitting by the window, looking out at the distant horizon, a faraway expression on her face. The soft light of the sun cast a warm glow over her, and for a moment, she looked almost peaceful. "How's the view?" Jake asked, stepping into the room. Lyra turned toward him, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, her gaze still fixed on the vast expanse outside. "I never thought I'd see anything like this." Jake walked over to the chair next to her bed and sat down. "It's a pretty big change from the desert, I bet." Lyra nodded. "I don't know how I ended up there. I was part of a group, and then everything went wrong." She paused, her fingers playing with the edge of the blanket. I remember getting separated, wandering for days, and then nothing but heat and sand. I didn't think anyone would find me." Jake's heart clenched at her words. He could see how deeply the experience had affected her, how much pain and fear she had carried before he found her. "But you're here now. You're safe." "I know," Lyra replied, her voice quiet. "And I'm thankful for that. But I don't know what comes next. My people, my home. I don't even know where they are." Jake looked at her, feeling the weight of her uncertainty. She had no answers, no clear direction, and he knew that the emptiness she must have felt was overwhelming. "You're not alone anymore," Jake said, his voice steady. "I'll help you find answers. Whatever you need." Lyra turned to him, her eyes soft but filled with a quiet determination. "Thank you, Jake. I'm not sure what I'd do without you." Jake smiled, but there was something in her words that made his chest tighten. He wasn't sure what he was offering her. He wasn't a savior. He wasn't someone with all the answers. But one thing he did know was that, somehow, their paths had crossed for a reason. "Let's take it one step at a time," Jake said, trying to keep the mood light. "We'll figure it out together." As Lyra nodded, Jake realized something. This wasn't just about keeping her safe anymore. He wasn't just her rescuer. Something had changed between them, something unspoken but powerful. The days passed more easily now. The pain of the past slowly faded for Lyra, replaced by the warmth of safety. With each new day, she grew stronger, physically and emotionally. The base had become her home, and Jake Lawson had become her steady anchor. Lyra spent most of her time in her room, recovering, but she had started to venture out into the base more often. She would wander around, asking Jake about Earth and his experiences, always curious about things she had never seen before. She learned more about the soldiers, about their mission, and about life beyond the harsh desert she had known for so long. But as the days went by, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Lyra was still haunted by something. There was a quiet sadness in her eyes, even when she smiled. She often stared at the stars at night, her mind clearly far away. Jake understood that she missed her home, her people. He couldn't promise her that everything would be okay, but he could be there for her. One evening after dinner, Jake found Lyra standing at the edge of the base, looking up at the sky. The stars were bright and clear, shining like tiny diamonds scattered across a vast, endless canvas. It was a peaceful night, the kind where everything felt calm, yet there was still that underlying feeling of change. "Lyra," Jake called softly, walking up to her. She turned toward him, her eyes softening when they met his. "I can't help but think about my home," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "About my people. I wonder if they're out there somewhere, lost, like I was." Jake moved closer, standing beside her. "I know it's hard," he said, his voice gentle. "But we'll figure it out. We'll find your people. And if not, we'll find a new place for you, a place where you belong." She looked at him then, her expression filled with both gratitude and something more. "You don't know what that means to me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to thank you." Jake shrugged, a faint smile on his face. "You don't have to thank me. I did what anyone would have done. But if you really want to thank me, keep fighting for your future. Keep living." Lyra's eyes searched his face, and in that moment, she saw something new, something more than just kindness. She saw a connection between them, something that had grown quietly between the two of them over the days. Jake had saved her life, yes, but now, he had become someone she couldn't imagine her life without. She took a deep breath, and without thinking, said, "Jake, I don't know what to say, but I feel like I don't want to be alone anymore. I want to stay with you, not just because you saved me, but because I think I care about you." Jake's heart skipped a beat at her words. He had known, in his heart, that something had been growing between them, but hearing her say it so plainly made everything feel real. "I care about you too, Lyra," Jake said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I'll be here, no matter what. We'll figure this out together." For the first time since they had met, Lyra smiled, a full, genuine smile. She was no longer just a survivor of the desert. She was someone with a future, and Jake was a part of it. The stars above twinkled brightly, a reminder that no matter how vast the universe was, there was still a place for her, and with Jake by her side, she felt like she could finally begin again.